gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Graham Price, and you're all very welcome to this session of the Pedagogics of Unlearning conference. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Michael and Eamon for asking me to chair this talk and the discussion afterwards. It is my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sam Chambers, to you this morning. Sam Chambers is Associate Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. He has written several books, including The Lessons of Rancière, Queer Politics of Television, and Judith Butler and Political Theory. Troubling Politics being the subtitle of the Judith Butler book. He has published numerous articles on topics ranging from queer theory, political science, literary analysis, and popular culture. He is also the co-editor of the journal Contemporary Political Theory, and his paper for us today is entitled Learning How to Be a Capitalist. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sam Chambers.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for that nice introduction. Thanks.
We can hear you.
Oh, is this microphone? No. I can speak up, but if there's a microphone, I can also speak into it. What do you think, Gareth? Yeah, it was. Hello? Hello?
Not yet.
No? Is it better? I hear it. I hear it.
1, 2.
Yeah. Okay. Now am I too loud? No, it's good. Okay. Thanks for the technology. I was thanking Michael and Eamon for inviting me. It's a real humbling delight to be a part of this conference. Amazing group of speakers. I kind of feel like what I really should have done is just listen to all the papers up to this point and written something completely different, because I have so many new thoughts in my head. I'm going to try to suppress them for the next 90 minutes so that I can focus on these other things that maybe, as Lauren mentioned earlier, they might seem a little stale even to me, given that there's so much more piling in. But I did want to, where is it? Yeah, hi. I wanted to steal your words earlier because my piece, kind of like yours, is all brand new. I've just written it recently, and I very much would love to have that kind of exchange and input to see where it's going to go next. Before I get to that, I just want to start off with my foundational claim to speak here today, a Jacques-Towian claim to ignorance, which is that as someone who primarily teaches and secondarily writes about political theory and cultural politics, the questions of pedagogy, the questions of teaching and learning, really are central to everything I do. And yet, when I received the invitation to speak, my first reaction, which I literally spoke aloud, was, I don't know anything about pedagogy. And of course, on reflection, I have worked on my own pedagogics for quite a while, thought about and discussed teaching and learning, and even written a bit and published on pedagogy in a variety of contexts. But I think my second reaction that explains the first would be to say that everything I know about pedagogy, everything I've ever said about pedagogy, is borrowed or stolen from others. And here I'm not being disingenuous. In the classroom, I do employ a number of non-traditional techniques, approaches, assignments, and I've had students and colleagues comment on my approaches as unique. Sometimes they mean that as really strong praise, sometimes they mean that as you are absolutely crazy. But the truth of any of that is that it really is, it's all stolen. Most of it from my graduate advisor, some of it from my partner, some of it from colleagues and students. And I explain this all to graduate students whenever they ask to borrow one of my pedagogical techniques or assignments. And I try to go on to tell them that as far as I can tell, all good pedagogy is borrowed, adapted, reworked, stolen. And when it comes to what I've written about pedagogy in relation to politics, that theft is even more obvious since it's all been absconded from the powerful, important, and enduring writings of Jacques Rancière. Of course, one might say, and not immodestly, that he stole it from Jacques Towian. So, my ignorance in the record, I hope. I want to move on, and today I want to talk about capitalism. Specifically, I want to talk about neoliberal capitalism, And more specifically still, I want to talk about one strand of neoliberal capitalism, which is human capital theory, and the work of Gary Becker that inaugurates that thought. So let me start by giving you my thesis, stated very baldly, and then I'll try to do some of the excavation work necessary to support it. My primary and most general contention is that the fundamental idea of human capital remains imbricated with the pedagogics. At the core of this strand of neoliberalism, but I suspect, and I'm going to imply today in neoliberalism more broadly, there lies a theory of education, a specific vision of teaching and learning. And for just this reason, I think the battle against neoliberalism requires a pedagogics of unlearning, in the very simple sense that any challenge to neoliberalism depends upon a prior unlearning of the neoliberal theory of education. And in order to accomplish this unlearning, I think we must first learn what that pedagogics looks like. By this I mean that we need to trace, analyze, and understand that pedagogics of neoliberalism. This is the case because neoliberalism's pedagogy goes mostly unnoticed and unremarked upon, and it's certainly not something that is self-consciously foregrounded by neoliberal thinkers. Because neoliberals do not advertise the pedagogy as such, it allows it to operate sometimes more tacitly, more silently, and for those very reasons, sometimes more powerfully. So my task today is going to do a few things. First, I'm going to separate out and specify human capital theory as a significant strand of neoliberal thought by giving a very, very succinct overview genealogy of neoliberalism. Then the main project of my talk today is to unpack human capital theory's tacit pedagogics by way of a close reading of Gary Becker's work. And then finally, briefly, in the end, I want to offer some suggestions of alternatives to the neoliberal pedagogy, what I'm tentatively calling the pedagogics of mystery, which I think might be a pedagogics of unlearning. So first, the traditional story of neoliberalism in the university. I think this is a story that everyone here already knows well. There's already been a linking of neoliberalism with the question of pedagogy, with pedagogical concerns, because most of us are living in or through this emerging neoliberal university. And I use that term as a catch-all that remains powerfully multivalent. It points to the in-progress takeover of the university by neoliberal capitalism, but also perhaps to the university as a site of resistance to neoliberalism. In this traditional story, I think that the relationship between neoliberalism and the university has typically been framed in terms of spaces or domains on the one hand, or logics on the other hand. That is, the university is thought of as a specific site, operating according to its own logic, while market-based, profit-driven capitalism is thought of as a distinct logic operating on its own terrain. And neoliberalism, in this narrative, thus names a phenomenon of encroachment, or worse, invasion or colonization. Within this conception, neoliberalism is taken to be a form of late capitalism marked above all by the expansion of the logic of the market to all domains of life, including especially all public institutions. But instead of looking at what happens to pedagogy when the forces of neoliberalism arrive on the scene of the university, I want instead to ask what neoliberalism, not what neoliberalism does to and extant pedagogics. I want to analyze the type and nature of the pedagogy that neoliberalism harbors within itself, internal to its own force and functioning. And so the standard story of the neoliberal university, I think, contains a blind spot in that it fails to see that neoliberalism has its own vision of pedagogy even before it encounters these pedagogical institutions. So in order to analyze neoliberalism's pedagogy, I want to be quite clear first about what I mean by neoliberalism and about where exactly I want to look when I look for this pedagogy. I think we all know that neoliberalism is a term of growing capaciousness, and the rise in its use to name or critique various dimensions of contemporary capitalism has been accompanied by a loss of specificity in its meaning. And I hear many defenders of liberal capitalism today suggest that the use of the term by critics of capitalism serves as a sign of lazy thinking. The logic here is basically, if you see something you don't like, call it a phenomenon of neoliberalism so as to disparage it. Of course, thought from the other side that those folks who ridicule any use of the term neoliberalism are usually themselves defenders of many of its principles, even if they refuse to name them as such. And here I'm just rehearsing in general terms debates that go on within my department all the time, where one colleague disparages neoliberalism and the other person's comment starts by saying, well, I don't know what neoliberalism is, but... What I'm trying to do here is agree with those critics a tiny bit and then respond to them. That is, I do think clarity is required when discussing neoliberalism, and this is not just because of the contemporary broad use of the term, but because of the varied and uneven history of neoliberal political economic thought on the one hand, and neoliberal political rationality on the other. So, a very crude map to start, a few categorical distinctions among various strands of neoliberalism. And one, of course, could do an entire project of typology on neoliberalism. I don't want to do that, but I want to have a little bit of a grid to work with. So, three strands of neoliberalism that I think are worth mapping out to specify my location on the map. The first is ordoliberalism, a particular historical development in the history of economic ideas centered in Germany in the middle of the 20th century, and hinging on the notion that the market can be allowed to work properly and effectively on its own, if not hindered by the state. But this is not just laissez-faire classical liberalism, since as Foucault elegantly puts it, the essential ordoliberal idea is actually to invert classical liberalism. Thus, rather than having the state act as a certain limit on the free market, the ordoliberals, quote, adopt the free market as organizing and regulating principle of the state, end quote. So instead of having a market that supervises the state, classical liberalism, we get a state under the supervision of the market, or under the supervision of the pervasive logic of the market. So that's ordoliberalism. The second strand is neoliberalism as the quote-unquote Washington consensus on monetary, domestic, and foreign policy. So where ordoliberalism is marked primarily as a politico-economic theory, this second variant of neoliberalism is marked primarily as a political rationality expressed in public policy. And David Harvey is doubtless the clearest voice in analyzing this strand of neoliberalism. He describes it primarily as a response to the crisis of capitalism of the 1970s, and he sees it as an alternative to the mid-20th century variant of embedded capitalism. Within Harvey's logic, neoliberalism disembeds capital from state structures and institutions, using low inflation monetary policy, financialization, outright coercion of developing countries to follow a path of capital through the IMF and World Bank. Third, and finally, is human capital theory, a specific type of American liberal economic theory of which Gary Becker is the central figure. At its core, the really large edifice that is human capital theory has now been applied to countless domains of economic, social, and political life. But at its core, it rests, I'm going to argue, on one major logical move or assumption. The theory of human capital starts out with all the core tenets of modern microeconomic theory firmly in place. And modern micro-theory is the so-called theory of the firm, the economic theory of how firms operate rationally in the context of classical economic markets, of how a firm maximizes profit in the face of other firms doing exactly the same thing. Human capital theory makes just one profound addition to microeconomics. It says simply, what if we treat the individual just like a firm? What if we reprogram all of the parameters of modern microeconomic theory through the individual as an autonomous economic agent that seeks to maximize return on investment? Now that's my gloss on human capital theory. Becker probably wouldn't quite put it this way, but I would say that is because to Becker, the idea of treating the individual like the firm comes almost naturally. If you read a lot of Becker, and I have been doing so recently, you see that for him, the rationality of the firm in microeconomic theory simply is rationality. There can be no doubt that in the contemporary conjuncture, these three strands of neoliberalism are very much intertwined. But for my purposes today, what I want to do now is leave Friedman, the World Bank, Harvey, and the ordoliberals behind. I want to look at Becker's work. It's been popularized in his application of human capital theory to family life, prison, punishment, the list goes on and on. But to get at his pedagogy, I want to look at the most basic elements of human capital theory to see how he carries off the move by which we treat all individuals like microeconomic firms. So I focus on Becker's 1962 Journal of Political Economy article titled Investment in Human Capital, a Theoretical Analysis. And this is an article that was published in an economics journal, but then became the core chapter of Becker's Human Capital book. It's gone through multiple editions, but the chapter that's still there, even in the most recent editions, looks pretty much just like the 1962 economics journal article. I came to a deeper appreciation of Becker's thought, a better sense of its influence through teaching him, actually, and through discovering that I taught a course called How to Be a Capitalist. We read a bunch of texts, most of them critical of capitalism, but all trying to get at the logic of capital. And my students, despite reading weeks and weeks of Marx and reading Smith and Ricardo and all these anti-capitalist and communist thinkers, ultimately were convinced by Becker. It was Becker who explained their world to them. And that's one of the reasons why I turned back to an even closer analysis of Becker, to ask what he taught my students, and to ask what Becker's work teaches us about teaching. My claim is that we witnessed the clearest crystallization of the neoliberal pedagogy in this classic articulation of human capital theory. And I'd be willing to call Becker's early work essential reading today for the very reason that it contains an obvious and plainly important to the neoliberal project theory of education. And I think all this holds despite the fact that even in Becker, the pedagogics remains very much tacit. What is instead most readily apparent in Becker is not the pedagogics itself, but rather the theory's absolutely undeniable requirement of a pedagogics. That is, Becker's theory of human capital only works, only makes any sense at all, if teaching and learning function in a specific set of ways, according to particular constraints, and with a specified set of goals or ends. So I think that we can say that Becker's theory of human capital necessarily presupposes a very specific, very definite understanding of what it means to teach, to learn, to know. And to explicate that neoliberal pedagogy, I start by emphasizing that even in its original form, which is again a specialized economics journal article, and one of the things I'm doing in my reading of the text and in my talk today is leaving out about 50 equations, because most of the article moves by a few lines of text, equation, a line of text, equation, equation, equation. But there's a logic that's quite clear that runs through that. In that articulation of human capital theory, Becker appeals to common sense. Common sense is how we approach the economic world for the 1960s American economists. And so in the opening paragraph, Becker states what seem like truisms. Some choices, he says, we make have an impact on the present, and some affect future well-being. Then, betraying class distinctions that I think he would resolutely deny, Becker offers the example of dining for the former and purchasing a sailboat for the latter. So we have these two options, future or present, sailboat being the future, dining being the present, and then he says the following, in a claim that I think buries his thesis within a straightforward declaration of his topic. Quote, "This paper is concerned with activities that influence future real income through the embedding of resources in people. This is called investing in human capital." End quote. In other words, rather than setting out to prove conceptually or theoretically that we can or should understand humans as objects in which we can invest, that would be a contentious philosophical claim, or that we can take capital as a set of fixed, static, and timeless resources, that would be a potentially radical historical and economic claim, Becker instead presupposes the veracity of both of these positions, and then purports to report, almost descriptively or empirically, on the nature, extent, and implications of such practices. So his presentation of the original argument takes shape mainly in the form of these complex algebraic equations, but the basic assumptions we can work through quite clearly. Becker starts with the grounding micro-assumptions that markets for both labor and goods are purely competitive and in full equilibrium. So wages will be, as Becker puts it in one of the euphemisms of micro-theory, given to the firm. In other words, the firm's managers have no strategic say in determining wage rates, since wages will be determined by the purely competitive market forces, which means in this case, as Becker's first equation specifies, that wages are equal to the marginal product created by the worker. Human capital theory comes into being when Becker derives new equations by factoring in the question of on-the-job training. To raise the topic of job training for a firm means to inject a temporal dimension into the firm's profit-maximizing rationality. This is because on-the-job training functions as a cost to firms. If a firm devotes some of a worker's hours to training, the firm will pay the same overall wages, but the worker's productivity would be less than the marginal product given by the market. Yet from the firm's perspective, it may make sense to reduce revenue in the present if doing so can proportionally raise revenue in the future, and this would be precisely the result if the effect of on-the-job training is to make the worker more productive in the future. So it would seem that firms merely make calculations about the present costs and future benefits of training, and from those calculations arrive at decisions about whether and how much to provide on-the-job training. It's important for me to emphasize that had Becker's argument stopped here, all he would have done is make a small contribution to microtheory by working out the applications of on-the-job training. He would not have founded a new branch of economics, which is what he did, in fact. So the next step is very crucial. Becker turns the argument in the direction of a paradox. He introduces the distinction between general and specific on-the-job training. The former increases productivity in all firms, while the latter is useful only in the specific firm in which one works or trains. And the distinction forces Becker into questioning the basic rationality by which firms decide whether or not to provide training. General training is the problem here, and I'm calling it a problem. Becker doesn't. But you'll see in the logic that it works as one. General training causes the problem for firms because such training makes it irrational for firms to cover the cost of training in the form of reduced revenue due to lower productivity. This irrationality emerges because of the interaction between the temporal lag between the firm's expenditure on training and the anticipated return, combined with the distinct nature of general training. And the problem is this: a trained worker might leave the firm and take his or her training along, all before the firm reaps the reward for its investment in the worker. Even worse, because general training provides workers with skills, much more on that in just a minute, and given the requirement of pure competition, a worker will immediately reap the benefit of increased skills in the form of increased wages. And so therein lies the rub. Firms cannot capture any of the returns produced by general training. This means, therefore, that there is no competitive advantage to be gained by a firm choosing to pay for the cost of training. What firms would all like to do is hire workers who are already trained at other firms that they didn't have to pay for. Becker works this logic out and takes it to its radical conclusion. The problem he's dealing with here is how can we even explain how a firm would provide on-the-job general training? And so he asks this question: why then do rational firms in competitive labor markets provide training that brings no returns? Of course, by the founding definitions of microtheory, firms never do anything irrational. And when Becker uses the term rational firms, he's just giving us pleonasm. The answer that Becker provides on behalf of the firms should in a certain sense be obvious, but it's also, I think, somewhat counterintuitive to those of us not steeped in economic theory. Becker's explanation is as follows, and this quote really is the hinge of my entire project on Becker. Quote, "The answer is that firms would provide general training only if they did not have to pay any of the costs. Persons receiving general training would be willing to pay these costs, since training raises their future earnings. Hence, the cost would be borne by trainees and not by firms." End quote. It is irrational for firms to pay for training, so they will not do so. Somehow, those people being trained, that is workers, are going to pay for their own training. The problem of on-the-job training is thus solved by Becker by firms refusing to pay for such training and displacing the cost of training directly onto workers in the form of lower wages. Now, some might be tempted to say that a firm forces workers to cover the cost of their training in the form of lower wages, the same way we might think about many companies today having a dress code and forcing their workers to buy the clothes that fit them. But notice that this is not at all the language that Becker uses. Indeed, it is only for the first time at just this moment that Becker's narrative brings in the choices and actions of the worker. Once Becker's equations prove that it is irrational for the firm to pay for training, he shifts the logic and rationality onto the worker. And almost magically, it seems, it turns out that just the thing the firm needs the worker to do is precisely that which the worker would be willing to do. In an important way, the key idea of human capital theory emerges here and is always grounded on this logical turn. Becker's working out of the rationality of general on-the-job training turns workers into tiny little firms. Rather than the firm investing in the worker in the present in order to obtain a payoff in the future, we now have workers investing in themselves, a language that we hear constantly today, but which Becker is really creating in the terms of microeconomic theory here in 1962. So the worker invests in herself by paying the firm to train her, that is, by accepting lower wages. The problem for the firm is thereby solved once the worker is no longer selling his labor power for whatever wages he can get, but is instead making rational, firm-like decisions on return on investment. Now, the end result of pretending the worker can and will act like a capitalist is that workers are paid even lower wages than they would be in standard microeconomic theory. Arguably, even lower wages than they might be explained in a Marxist account. So Becker derives a new set of equations that express the equilibrium in general training, which is wages are marginal product minus the cost of training that the worker is now paying. The cost is deducted from the marginal product such that the worker is paid lower wages. In following Becker's logic, one can never forget that the logical switch he makes, whereby the worker is now acting like a firm in working through cost, benefit, and return on investment calculations, this substitution of the logic of the worker for the logic of the firm does not change the basic structural conditions of capitalism, in which the worker has no liquid assets to invest. The only assets the worker has are those provided by the firm in the form of wages. And Becker is proposing that it is rational for the firm to pay lower wages precisely because the worker rationally chooses to invest in her own human capital. So we have to ask, Becker doesn't, what exactly does the worker invest? Becker doesn't say it directly, but the answer is as obvious and commonsensical as the rest of his reasoning. The worker invests by making a loan to the firm in the form of lost wages. This means that the so-called investment in human capital theory, in human capital, is really nothing more than a new form of indebtedness of the worker to the firm. So Becker's argument, I'm suggesting here, reveals something that he himself never really seems to see. The firm will make its workers pay for their own training so that it, the firm, can maximize its profits. Thought from the side of the logic of the firm, there is never any space for the notion of human capital. The firm does not maximize the worker's so-called return on investment. Rather, Becker inserts the idea of worker return on investment, the essential idea of human capital. He inserts that idea almost as a deus ex machina in order to justify or explain why and how a firm will wind up paying even lower wages than microeconomic theory would otherwise predict. In one way, of course, Becker sees all of this clearly, since he shows that the firm will refuse to cover the cost of trainings of its own workers. But it's in that magical switch from the firm sees that it is irrational to pay this to workers would be willing to pay it in order to cover the costs. But Becker also believes truly and fiercely in the deeper idea of human capital that he introduces here. Within the structure of his logic, the claim that the worker would be willing to pay for his own training is at best an odd rhetorical flair, and at worst, patent nonsense or intentional ideology. Nothing in the basic micro-theory that Becker starts with requires us to consider or care about what the worker would be willing to do, and microeconomic theory usually ignores the worker. Nonetheless, reading from larger swaths of Becker's broader corpus, in which he has applied human capital theory to so many domains of life, one clearly perceives his genuine faith in the idea of human resources as capital resources that can be created just like money, roads, factories, and warehouses. And the bulk of Becker's corpus actually consists of expanding this idea, of spreading the gospel, as it were, of human capital theory, and thereby rethinking our very understanding of capitalism and capitalist societies based on the idea that the human being is a capital resource. So how can Becker substantialize this radical, and not only economic and political, but also ontological shift? When we say that we invest in ourselves, what does this mean? When we treat human beings as themselves forms of capital, what does this look like? It is easy enough to count up dollars and railroads and airplanes, but what do we count or measure or invest in when we invest in human capital? The constant yet always enigmatic answer is skills. Becker clarifies on the first page of his original article that the very idea of the human capital approach evolved out of a study designed to investigate the money rate of return to college and high school education. What is the return on investment in getting an education? And that the initial findings there indicate that earnings were always positively related to the level of skill. Skills translate into return on investment, while at the same time education and training are understood to produce, advance, or augment this very entity called skills. Skills are the pivot point for the entire framework of human capital theory. In one sense, skills take the form of a commodity. They're the answer to the question, what do you get when you pay for education or training? But skills are a problematic sort of commodity. They fail some of the first tests for any commodity. They're not distinct objects, they're not clearly fungible, and they're not alienable. Skills only manifest themselves in the body and person of the human being, so they cannot be a commodity like any other. And this explains why skills are always the ultimate answer to the fundamental question of human capital, since unlike other forms of capital, skills reside within and are in many ways indistinguishable from the human person. It's in this sense that skills are human capital, and human capital is nothing other than skills. In a way, then, it matters less what a skill is than how it functions. And for Becker, the empirical results here are clear. More skilled workers make more money. And those with more education and training make more money. So surely the increased money is exactly a return on investment. That's the structural logic. Skills are the linchpin of this argument. The worker invests in skills through education or training, and skills pay off in the form of higher earnings. Without skills, we would merely have a redundant or circular argument, since if we remove skills from the logic, all we wind up with is the notion that educated and trained workers receive higher wages. This is surely the case according to Becker's data, but he needs to establish more than a relationship between training and wage rates. Under the individualist and rationalist terms of microtheory, Becker needs to show that there is, first, a choice to pay for education training, that is then followed temporally by a return on this investment in the form of higher wages. So skills make the argument for human capital go. If the worker pays for skills first, and skills then produce returns, then we have a full account of the idea of human capital and of the individual rationality of the worker as being the same sort as the rationality of the firm. You can see this, it's like buying a stock for Becker. First you buy it, and then later you sell it and you get money back. This is what has to happen in skills. First we go to school and get skills, then we go out into the job market and our skills give us money back. That's return on investment. So everything is explained by the investment choice of individual workers, that is their choices to and of how to invest in themselves, where they are doing the same thing as someone with capital resources would be doing by buying stocks. This brings us to the crux of the matter. According to the terms and framework of human capital theory, education must be that thing that creates, extends, improves, or augments skills. Even though a skill cannot be a commodity like any other, it must still be at least analogized with the commodity, since education must be the practice that produces this good. And at this point, the now dominant idea of institutions of higher learning as institutions of skills production comes into sharp and powerful focus. Human capital theory has to insist, despite, I would suggest, little or no evidence to support this insistence, that education makes skills. And I'm certain this logic resonates powerfully with all of us who have worked in the context of the university over the past 10 to 20 years, since during that period of time, colleges and universities, especially their administrative managers who are thinking like the managers of microeconomic firms, have come more and more to translate Becker's insistence into their own insistence. We must be creating skills. We had a conversation yesterday, I can't remember who suggested it, but asked when it was when Jack was speaking about the idea of transferable skills being on the syllabus or module guide. When I taught in the UK, it was of course a requirement. You have to have that 3 to 5 bullet pointed list. It had to be on the first page. It was more important than the reading guide at the end. And that's the materialization of this very logic of human capital theory, that when the students come into the classroom, this is what you will be providing them with. Even though, as we all know, making up what those skills are can be a really brilliant project in rhetorical creation. Where do I get the words to describe that actually what we're going to do in here is read interesting texts and develop abilities to think critically, etc. In the requirement that such a list of skills be produced for each and every single module taught, we witness this materially powerful expression of the core idea of human capital theory. The job of the teacher is to facilitate the individual student's rational choice to invest in themselves, and the teacher can only do so if what the teacher provides are skills that the student may later use to reap a return on investment. They pay us for skills, which they then leverage to produce a future income stream. Now that, I think, starts to get us toward the pedagogy of human capital. If skills are what we learn in education and job training, then what does this tell us about those practices, institutions themselves? What goes on or must go on for Becker inside the black box that is schooling? How must we understand the material institutions and the concrete practices that for him carry out this fundamental function of producing skills? Now I think we can go a long way to filling in neoliberal pedagogy based solely on the structure of the theory of human capital and the essential role of skills transmission. That is, we can answer the question of a pedagogics of human capital theory by way of a brute logical deduction from its core tenets. We deduce a rudimentary neoliberal pedagogy from what human capital theory requires, and that theory entails a direct functional answer to the question of pedagogy. It comes in the form of a tautological definition. A school simply is whatever institution produces skills in the sense dictated by human capital theory. But we can go further than that because Becker himself gives us his own account of what a school is, and he gives us a clear and succinct definition in this very same article that I've been reading from and interpreting earlier. Quote, "A school can be defined as an institution specializing in the production of training, as distinct from a firm that offers training in conjunction with production of goods," end quote. So you see quite clearly what a school is comes straight out of microtheory. He's been talking about the logic of the firm in which firms will produce training, and then he asks, well, what is a school? Oh, they're specialists in that. That's all they do is provide training. And the argument takes a crucial turn here because Becker indicates that while a school may be in some sense a distinct institution, it is in no way unique since the school and the firms are at all times complementary, that's Becker's word, in their function, and on occasion even interchangeable. Becker reaches this logic by making another one of his profound and far-reaching assumptions. He treats the student as nothing other than a would-be worker. Becker runs the exact same equations for the student who goes to high school or college as he had run for the worker who takes a job. There's a tiny change in notation, otherwise everything looks the same. The worker's cost of training in the form of reduced wages is not at all distinct, according to these equations, from the student's cost of education and going to school. The only difference is that the student's cost includes foregone earnings, so he has to introduce a consideration of the marginal product the student would get if they took a job instead. And the calculations that we hear so commonly today, particularly in the United States, as the cost of college and university education has skyrocketed up, well, students shouldn't go to school, it doesn't pay. Again, traced back 50 years to what's going on in Becker's logic right here. Becker completes this logic by drawing what should now appear to his readers an unsurprising conclusion. Quote, a sharp distinction between schools and firms is not always necessary. For some purposes, schools can be treated as a special kind of firm, and students a special kind of trainee. Yet one should not let the inertial force of this logic obscure the radical implications here. In a few simple paragraphs, Becker has turned all students into workers. Attending school is fundamentally about nothing other than choosing, or not, to defer wages in a rational way. According to human capital theory, we are all, including college and secondary school students, always already workers. We are investors in our own human capital prior to any external consideration of the meaning or importance of education. Education simply cannot be considered for Becker outside of the frame of improving the return on investment in human capital. And I here emphasize that in calling schools a special kind of firm and students a special kind of trainee, Becker actually troubles the now standard neoliberal account of the university as a firm that sells the education commodity to that mongrel hybrid customer students. Becker's not so much analogizing the university to the firm, such that the university has to sell a product and make a profit, but incorporating the logic of the university into the overall framework of human capital theory. If we extend Becker's remarks on the special nature of the university, we might say that from his perspective, schools are not designed to become full-fledged firms. Rather, the purpose of schools is to function in support roles for firms themselves. Firms train only as a secondary element of their primary function, to sell goods for profit, while universities primarily and exclusively train. This account leads to some really thorny, unanswered questions for Becker, but also by extension to contemporary neoliberals. If a school has training as its only output, then is training its product, or does it have no product? Is the school meant to sell training? If so, who does the school sell to? The only answer to this last question would appear to require making students into customers. And I know we hear that commonly today. It's frequently demanded and presumed by today's neoliberal university reformers. But Becker himself only ever treats students like workers, not like customers. How can a student be both a trainee worker of the firm and also that firm's customer? We see that the attempt to conceptualize the school rigidly as the firm requires students to occupy two completely incompatible roles. And ultimately, any strict correspondence between the school and the firm breaks down, because in Becker's basic account, we can say that the school is not just a special kind of firm, but rather a unique kind. If the school produces only training, then its output is consumable only by its own trainees. Narrowly speaking, within Becker's logic, the school has no customers. And so the attempt to contain the school within the logic of the firm is followed through really consistently in Becker, and much more so than in generic neoliberal form of the university that we see today. But just like those concrete transformations that we witness in the present world, Becker's theoretical account has a lot of gaps and impasses. We can see that his human capital theory tries to capture and maintain schooling within the logic of the firm, but the reconceptualization of schools and teaching within the terms of neoliberal human capital theory is nowhere near complete, because he has no way of fully containing it there. And despite the fact that many of the basic tenets of human capital theory are themselves the driving forces for today's neoliberal reformulations of the university, those very changes to universities often deviate dramatically from Becker in their understanding of the relationship between a firm and a university. There is no foundation in Becker for today's calls to treat customers like students. That doesn't work for Becker. He wants schools to look like some little version of the firm that's helping feed us into firms. But the idea that we would run the university for a profit is not compatible with his account. So Becker's attempt to incorporate the school into his overall theory of human capital requires that he tacitly develop a pedagogics that underwrites the basic notion of human capital. But in working through that logic and comparing it to some commonplace contemporary neoliberal ideas about the school as producing the commodity of skills for student customers, we see that there can be no simple and direct correspondence between firms and schools. Becker's logic begins with the assumption that the school is a type of firm, but it begins to fall apart in a variety of ways. the school or university cannot be held within the basic structure of microeconomic theory, even as it's reformulated by human capital theory. Now, many of us might say instinctively and forcefully, all of this is because it never makes much sense to think of schools like firms, or to think of teaching and learning like producing and selling a product. And my main project here has been to show how central a theory of pedagogy is to the strand of neoliberalism that is human capital theory, and then in turn to demonstrate that such a pedagogy is untenable because it depends upon a logically contradictory account of the school, which doesn't mean it isn't still functionally efficacious in all sorts of ways that are significant and need to be thought about. I'd like to conclude, though, by trying to suggest the need to augment what has been my primary project here today, to work through neoliberal pedagogy, with another, which is to ask ourselves the question, if we aren't producing and selling a product, then what are we doing? And how can we articulate what we are doing more than merely negatively? Now, there's no singular answer to this question, of course. There's no formula for capturing what goes on when teaching and learning occur. But I want to close with just one suggestion by drawing a clue for a distinct pedagogics from another political economy, this time that of Marx. Now, Marx was a lot of things in his life, but unlike many canonized figures in the history of political thought and philosophy, he was not a professional teacher. He did not hold or aspire to hold a university post, yet he was a teacher nonetheless, or so I want to argue. And in certain of his writings, we can witness his pedagogy, one that I'm suggesting might serve as a model for or spur to our own efforts to revitalize the sort of pedagogics that could help sustain today's university. And to sustain today's university means to challenge and resist the neoliberal hegemony. One can locate Marx's pedagogy, or the one I'm looking for at least, in many of his less polemical texts, including in Capital, since in that work Marx is not stridently defending a predetermined position, but rather working through and working out with his reader a certain understanding of the way the world works. But I think an even better example of Marx's teaching comes in the effort to summarize, synthesize, and present for a popular audience the dense and complex arguments of Capital. So I'm referring here to Marx's paper, Value, Price, and Profit, which is the written version of a talk Marx gave in June 1865 at the First International. Unpublished in either his lifetime or Engels', this short paper first served the purpose to refute the so-called theory of wages fund. I'll leave that aside. At the same time, Marx took this opportunity to draw out and synthesize some of the most fundamental arguments of Capital Volume 1, which he was writing at the time he gave this talk. And in trying to condense very long, consistently complex, and dense arguments from Capital, and to do so in a spoken talk to workers and non-specialists in political economy, Marx took up the de facto role of teacher. And it's in that context that I want to try to read Value, Price, and Profit as containing not only the outlines of Marx's understanding of capital, but the stark traces of a vibrant pedagogy. Marx teaches his students about value, wages, price, profit, and about capital in general, not by specifying empirical facts or laying down general laws. His primary aim is not to render political economy transparent, but rather, and even I think for 19th century observers and participants, much more so as we read him today, to restore a sense of the mystery of capitalism. Marx, as teacher, approaches his students not by assuming he knows lucidly something of which they are only dimly aware, but which he will render clear. In a different context, I would argue that here, at least, Marx is not a stultifier. Instead, he attempts to bring about a certain sense of wonder or awe at the general mechanisms and effects of the system of capitalism. This sense of mystery emerges throughout Marx's mature writings on capital, but it has been frequently and radically misunderstood. Rather than taking Marx as operating by the logic of inversion, in which he will unravel all mysteries, defetishize all fetishes, pierce all false surface appearances to locate inner truths, I think we do better to see that Marx wanted first and foremost to make his readers, his students, stand witness to the mysteries of capitalism. And there could be a whole series of examples of this, but I want to provide just two short ones to wrap up. First, for Marx, the very idea of equal exchange that goes about in capitalism is nothing less than a mystery. It is astonishing to Marx that a system of exchange can develop such that all commodities are rendered equal to one another, as long as we get the proportions correct. That X commodity A equals Y commodity B is an absolute wonder. It ought to stupefy us. Marx shows that there is a general social process at work that makes possible the equation and the genuine equality of things that are not equal, things that are not even both things, entities that in one sense ought not be even comparable. Long ago, and in an utterly distinct context, Jacques Rancière aptly called this an impossible equation. And Marx sets out to show how capitalism makes the impossible equation very much real. But to do this, he must first get his students to see capitalism as a process that operates precisely on the terrain of impossibilities. In order to explain the mystery of capitalism, of course, we would need to turn to the thorny question of the labor theory of value. I want to set that aside because my point is much simpler. Regardless of Marx's response to this mystery, his approach to teaching us about capitalism depends first on recognizing it as a mystery. And I think he makes the same move when it comes to offering his own unique and powerful contribution to our understanding of capital in the form of his theory of surplus value. Again, not working through the details of surplus value, the important pedagogical point comes much earlier when Marx asks the simple yet deep question, where does profit come from? And if you read Capital closely, it's amazing how serious he takes this question. He keeps asking it over and over again in a sense of, we haven't answered it before, we don't really know. Marx insists that classical political economy has never been able to answer this question because the political economists have never really asked it. They never see the wonder, the mystery of profit. This means that the political economy of Marx's time and ours cannot explain the fundamental dimension of capitalism, an element essential to all other economic explanations. The classical political economists fail utterly to understand the fundamental logic of capital because they cannot explain profit. Their failure comes because they do not see profit as Marx does, as a mystery. Profit can't be explained by so-called accounting profit, it can't be explained by gaming the system, and it can't be explained by nominal price increases. This is why in Value Price Profit, Marx repeatedly advances the formula to be proved, quote, profit is made by selling a commodity at its value, end quote. A capitalist system must have an element of genuine productive growth in it. Capital must somehow almost magically increase. It must augment itself and continually become more than it was. This is what Marx means by the self-valorization of value, and what he expresses in the reduced form of the general formula for capital, M to M prime. As Thomas Piketty puts it, in a brief moment where he, too, for a moment, glimpses the mystery of capital, quote, that capital yields rent is astonishing, end quote. Piketty, however, refuses to dwell on this mystery, whereas Marx lingers there for dozens of pages in Capital, and then spends dozens more attempting to come to terms with capital's self-valorization process through his own understanding of surplus value. I retell just a brief snippet from Marx's story in order myself to capture some sense of his capacity for re-enchanting the world by rendering it mysterious. What would it mean for our pedagogy to revolve around this fundamental dimension, this primary effort to render the world alien, foreign, strange? What would it mean to build a pedagogy on the premise and goal of instilling in our students a deep sense of wonder, of making it possible to return them, and for us to return with them, to that state in which we see the world as mysterious? Here is a rather Socratic hypothesis worth testing and revising. We can only truly learn when we take ourselves to be in a state of not knowing. Hence, learning depends upon approaching the world as if learning about it, understanding it, is not the same thing as knowing things and facts about it. The suggestion here is to follow Marx's lead when it comes to the equality of exchange or the growth of capital, by continually asking not just our students, but more importantly ourselves, how does that really work? And why is that really possible? What makes it so? Marx's pedagogy in Capital offers a stark divergence and illustrative contrast with Becker, when I expand on in more detail in the paper version of this. Becker presupposes exactly that which he ought to explore, explain, learn about. Marx, on the other hand, takes capitalism as a mystery to follow, to investigate, to continually engage with. And the mystery of capital offers one powerful example of an alternative pedagogy, precisely because so much of the world we live in is premised upon the putative fact that capital is not mysterious, but rather quite obvious. One of the messages that the capitalist world conveys to us is that we don't need to learn about it because we already understand it. X commodity A equals Y commodity B because when I give €2, I get a coffee back. It just must be true. Marx transforms the very question of how capitalism works into a mystery. In thinking through the manner in which Marx responds to that mystery and consistently renders it mysterious, one that the political economists of his day and the economists of ours take as utterly straightforward and unproblematic, we might find a clue or even a rough model for how we ought to think about our own reading practices, our own teaching and learning practices. Marx explains to his audience at the First International that if one cannot explain profits by assuming that the commodities sell at, not above or below their values, then in that case, he continues, you cannot explain it at all. Marx then notes the counterintuitive nature of this move when he says that this seems paradox and contrary to everyday observation. However, he continues in a powerful pedagogical twist. It is also paradox that the Earth moves around the sun and that water consists of two highly inflammable gases. Scientific truth is always a paradox, end quote. So pushing toward broader implications for pedagogics and bracketing the contentious debate over so-called science, let us leave the political economists behind so that we might turn our focus toward truth or knowledge, or better, toward teaching and learning. In order to do so, I would translate these statements of Marx into the following pedagogical principles. To learn is to discover mystery. To know is to know paradox. Indeed, I would like to submit that pedagogical principles ought not and cannot be statements of fact or articulations of knowledge truth. They must be subjunctive proclamations that force an ontological shift by altering the very form of the verb to be. Put differently, this means that to teach is always to proceed as if, and thus our pedagogical principles must not be a series of commands or dictates, but rather a string of what-ifs. What if we approach teaching as if all learning were paradox? What if learning exceeded or even had nothing to do with the accumulation of facts and information? What if skills were nothing other than the pure fabrication and phantasmic hypothesization of neoliberal theory? What if a core element of the school or the university were uncontrollable, unco-optable by the logic of neoliberalism? What if we could unlearn the neoliberal pedagogy and recommit to these very pedagogic principles of the mystery of learning?
Thank you, Sam, for an excellent, very interesting, thought-provoking paper. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Go around.
Oh, yeah. We've got time now for some questions and points, so I'd like to start. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam. Brilliant. I've got two questions, but I'll ask one. One question is about Napoleon Dynamite. But I won't ask you a question.
Okay. I'm so grateful.
Girls are attracted to skills. Hunting skills, nunchuck skills. Anyway, the question that I want to ask is, if you rewrote the first 3/4 of that paper as a kind of deconstruction of Becker and human capital theory, and published it in the right sort of neoliberal journal context, what do you think would happen? You know, what would happen if you could... Don't publish it in our context. You know, we all have been nodding along, agreeing neoliberalism bad. But what if you publish it in the neoliberal journal context? What happens?
Well, it's possible if you did just a little more of the rewriting that you could publish it in the neoliberal journal as an artifact of neoliberal discourse, right? That it wouldn't even be recognized as a critique in a certain sense. Because I'm focusing on this implicit pedagogics. I think there's a much more massive literature on skills that would sort of defend and articulate the notion of the school or the university's production of skills. So a couple answers in that case. I'm trying to pull to the surface the implicit pedagogics of neoliberalism, not because revealing it will make the neoliberal edifice collapse. That's clearly not going to happen. That model of critique is one I already would eschew. But I do think that to engage with the conflicts over teaching and learning and neoliberalism in the university, we need to see, it is productive to see that there is an implicit pedagogy here. So it might actually be a fruitful exchange with neoliberals. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think part of what's at stake is the fundamental belief in the rationality of human capital, which since Becker has become the language of common sense in so many places. So I'm trying to pull up some points that can be staked down to actually engage with them in terms of what those assumptions require and how we might challenge them and how we might have alternatives to them. So I don't know that it's a matter of persuading the neoliberals that they're wrong, but I do wonder, part of me wonders, especially the contradictions I see in reading Becker versus the practical neoliberal transformation of the university. This idea that we sell a commodity in the university and that we can run a university according to the profit motive, I think is problematic even within the terms of neoliberalism. So actually, if I was going to try to speak in that domain, I think that's the thing I would focus on. Maybe it's a little bit less the pedagogy than what's a university supposed to look like, because I think the neoliberals are themselves confused. I mean, they might want to try to sort out that confusion because they're certain that the profit motive can run everything, but I think it's an interesting, thorny problem for them.
Thanks, Paper. I was just going to ask you, I think the application of the idea of firm to the individual is a very useful one. But if an individual in this system becomes operative as a firm to maximise profits, which is potentially our everyday experience of how people operate in our society, does that not then have to take into account ideas of immaterial capital, cultural capital, symbolic capital, such as maybe like Bourdieu or Zygmunt Bauman or Lazzaretto would have considered, and that form of capitalising on absolutely everything, being able to reduce everything to a resource, is something that the university is, of course, very good at, because it may not be kind of financial profit, but it may be reputational profit, it may be cultural profit, and then the reproduction of all of those systems. And that to some extent, it's at the level of human interaction on any scale that can refuse the reduction to a resource. So whether like the reduction of anything, I mean that's what's, but to move to the system of remystifying that, there's a danger in remystifying it, that somehow the immaterial capital is more mystically less capitalizable, except, and that I'd be slightly wary of the danger of remystifying things that were no longer easily identifiable as capital, because Marx's whole thing is that all that solid melts into air, but air is highly capitalizable.
I think there's two parts that I owe you a good response on, and I think I have the first one, but I'm not sure of the second one. So the place I want to start is that I think part of the engagement with neoliberal theories, understanding of human capital theory, is to make a space for the position I would want to occupy, which is a rejection of the understanding of capital as stuff, both material and immaterial stuff. So I take a kind of unfashionable, back to a certain reading of Marx's position here. It's also David Harvey's position. But the idea that modern economic theory has, which is that anything you can add up, is, Piketty has this as well, it's all, if you add it all up, it's stuff that's capital, and then we can have cultural, symbolic, human capital, because we can add all that stuff up. I think capital is a relation. I think it's a social relation, and therefore it is not stuff. Just because there has been stuff throughout history doesn't mean there has been the relation of moving from creating profit, that movement from M to M prime. That is a social process which requires a social structure to support it. And this is why, for me, there is no such thing as human capital. I think that it is made up, because the worker doesn't have access to the resources that can mobilize the relationship of M to M prime. The worker can only go into debt. Now, human capital theory lets us think that it re-equalizes, because it lets us think that, no, there's not a fundamental difference between those who own the means of production and those who do not, because everybody can invest in themselves. I would reject that notion. But what that also means is that I also reject some of what I don't deny is important and interesting work of relations of exchange and circulation that may be identified as capital. I wouldn't want to identify them as capital. Now, that response may help restructure the point at the end about remystifying, because I think because I refuse the notion that human capital is actually capital, or even that stacks of money in and of themselves are capital. They're only capital when they're thrown into circulation to come back with more. I'm not worried about, I'm not quite sure what the difference might be between thinking of it as mysterious, which is the language I use, and remystifying, which is the language that you use. There may not be a gap there, but there may be a necessary one. But because capital is only the social structural process, I don't see the problem in that.
I really love the picture of Rika that I read, but okay, so first I just want to kind of support the last speaker's question and say that I feel like the end of your paper could be the end of almost any paper. So you could just take that and have it as the last section of any paper you write, because it didn't really respond to the first 3/4 of your paper. And it was like, I want something different. So
Yeah.
and I just felt, so it's interesting also. I don't exactly know what to say about that. But the second thing was, and what I thought was that you could make more of an integration in your thought, in your argument, by thinking, Becker is interested in controlling a process, and so are you. And so what you want pedagogy is to be, have respect for the enigma of the object. And Becker wants pedagogy to be the respect for the training of subjects. And he just wants a different thing than you want, so whatever. So. And when you were talking, I was thinking, now I have a sentence I can say to students, which is, I'm not here to sell you knowledge, I'm here to give you skills. But then that produces, from your perspective, a kind of neoliberal insidiousness. But then the question of why, what your relation to a form of training that wouldn't be neoliberal is, I would love to hear more about that. And I also thought, so I would love to hear more about that, because I think that's really, really super interesting. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I don't think there's a contradiction within the university for it to be a space of commerce and a space of training if what it's selling is the credential.
Oh, sure.
And so I thought that maybe in a revision or something you think about the credential a little bit, because the part of what's commercial about the university is what you get at the end. You get training all the way through, and then you get the credential at the end, and that's why a lot of students retrofit the discourse of being a consumer to their classes, because they think they're buying the credential and they don't think, they're not sure about the relation between the credential and training, and I thought that might be interesting for you to amplify.
Yeah, that's great. So the credential part, yes, is essential, and it's clearly, whether credentialing is a marker for skills in the logic of human capital theory, or whether credentialing just is the commodity that universities can produce because they have a brand. I mean, I think that's the second line is the line I would go with that, which really means that it's mainly just branding. I mean, it's the same way that major corporations, why they spend money on advertising, that is just about having a brand. It's about the value of that thing. So that and those two things are intermixed, absolutely. I would want to try to yes, resist you giving your students skills. There's a line at the end of the first chapter of The Ignorant Schoolmaster. I'm not going to get it quite right, but it's what the result would be of the process of universal teaching, that the student will learn what he wants or what he does. Nothing maybe. I think that nothing maybe is crucial. There's a way to use the language of skills in a nominal sense, that what we're teaching is the ability to write and think and critical thinking and learning, and I totally buy all that, but I also feel like skills have been hegemonized by a neoliberal logic, and so I want to think about the classroom as a space of learning and engagement that cannot be concretized into those bullet points of not even skills, but transferable skills. So I'd want to go from not selling knowledge, not giving skills, but producing a space of encounter for learning that can be something beyond the bullet points. I think you're right about the last quarter of the paper. I felt I should give the audience something other than here's what's going on in Gary Becker. I do think there can be more of, I think there are threads there in terms of the reading of political economy by way of pedagogy, and I think that the idea of trying to understand, but recognizing that understanding is understanding mystery, is one way of, and there may be multiple, of maintaining a certain resistance to the concretization of knowledge as a set of objects and facts, and I think that's important, though clearly underdeveloped. I think a separate project that's not part of this paper and is maybe too big for me to ever write, but one that we collectively need to think through, is what it means to be teaching now at university college level of the generation of students who all have Google and Wikipedia. Because I think they have a lived relationship to knowledge that is radically different from what most of us experienced as we went through these same institutions. And I think it's important to start having discussions by which we articulate what does learning mean if it's not the assembly of facts. What does it mean that the university was once a space that had all those books and all those experts and all that stuff, so you went off to have access to that knowledge? Well, you also had access to that community of learning, and if we still think of it as having access to knowledge, then the university is a no place, because we all have Google and Wikipedia and all the knowledge is there. So that's one kind of explanation for what that thread is going on, but it needs a great deal more development.
I really like your suggestion of sort of bringing mystery back into the classroom as kind of like a critical approach to teaching and pedagogy. But I'm wondering if that's really enough. I mean, I'm going to kind of revert to the sort of boring, sort of traditional way of thinking about sort of critical teaching, and even in reference to Marx's entire project, which was certainly starting from mystery and sort of exposing the classical political economists of what they thought was obvious, but sort of like showing that there was a mystery in there, but he then approached it through his approach to immanent critique. And I'm wondering if that still is, you know, relevant to peeling away all of these mysteries. I mean, you know, he starts with that initial paradox, as you said, the sort of the paradox of exchange value. So you have all these different commodities, and somehow they have to universally commensurate. And then so he thinks about it for a while, and he introduces the commodity of money as the universal commodity, and then suddenly through a number of steps, he realized that labor itself and labor power is, as you said, kind of in relation to education and skills, it's a really peculiar commodity, because it's not created by capital. And so it has this capacity within itself to create more value than is required to reproduce it, right? And so, and from there, you know, you go through all 3 torturous volumes of Capital that sort of like unfolds this insight. But, you know, I think that's part of like stripping away the sort of the colonization of capital, is realizing that things like land and labor, skills, our knowledge, our affect, is not really created by capital. It can be in some instances. I mean, it could be subsumed in a number of ways, but it, as you say, it's kind of like inalienable. And I think this is like a really good first step, this sort of immanent critique that, you know, sort of captures the whole Marx's approach. It does help us to get away from this idea that capital is stuff, and get away from the obviousness of economics. Because when we just look at stuff, even human bodies, you're right, and if we don't think about it hard enough, we just think, well, it's, you know, ultimately it's because some firm or some, you know, we start to think of ourselves as kind of like produced by something else. And yeah, I think breaking through that is an important way of sort of reclaiming our own innate powers, sort of, you know, moving away from alienation as a way of just sort of like, yeah, reconsidering our place in the world. And I'm wondering whether mystery is a great starting point, but whether immanent critique still should be one of the main drivers for critical pedagogy.
That's a great question. It's also a very thorny question with lots of levels to unpack. The short answer is yes, depending on what we mean by immanent critique. So I think there is a Frankfurt School, a post-Frankfurt School traditional understanding of immanent critique that we might trace back to Horkheimer's traditional and critical theory that I would want to push back on to a certain extent, because it takes a kind of understanding of immanent critique that the structure is a totality, and that we will locate the critique internal to it, and that movement critique will break it apart, as it were. I want to read a Marx that's much more historically rich and has a much richer historical sense, and therefore, when you speak about the commodity of labor power, which I think Marx also talks about in terms of mystery, labor power is like magic beans. It's just this crazy thing that capitalist social formation makes possible, and the answer to where profit comes from is, wow, there's this one crazy commodity that works differently than all the others. But it does so because of historical conditions that produced it as such. So there is a space for a kind of immanent critique that's much more genealogical, that's much more Nietzschean and Foucauldian than it is rigid in a certain Frankfurt School and 20th century Marxist with a capital M version. I think that version of immanent critique with a small I can very much be compatible with the exploration of the mystery of learning that I've tried to articulate here. There's a lot of connections that need to be made.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. It was really rich, and it's given me loads of things to think about. And as you were talking, I started to think about the similarities between the idea of skills and the idea of unlearning, because to me they both are quite mysterious concepts. And there's something about skills though that, for me, I mean, maybe I'm slightly biased because I worked in skills development, but actually there was something really hopeful about that for some people. What it offered for some was some assumptions of hope towards meritocracy, even if it didn't exist. It allowed people to say, well, I have something as a product of my investment that mattered to me more than it might have mattered to other people, because it makes explicit things that for others might have been implicit. And it did a lot of work to think about how we have unequal access to those skills. So, for instance, lots of work on employability has looked at how good communication is actually a really class-gendered thing, and it doesn't really mean anything, but it's allowed us to talk about that. So I wondered if you could talk about, I suppose I feel a bit nervous about remystifying learning's products, which are already really mysterious anyway, and are more mysterious to some people more than others. Something like that.
Yeah, that's a very important dimension. It's easy to challenge the neoliberal account of skills crossing half a century of time, because what has now happened is that that neoliberal account is the world we live in, and therefore there's a large series of discourses of skills that function in ways that go well beyond that, and you're articulating a really important one. I still want to hope for a possibility that there is a counter discourse of education, learning, growth, improvement, transformation that doesn't have to be concretized as skills, especially since I do think that part of that possibility for the meritocracy is bogus, because what's actually happening, as Lauren suggested, is a series of credentials that are being produced, and those who have the credentials are assumed to have the so-called skills without an actual assessment of whether they do. Obviously, the conclusion is not that we should change language and somehow tomorrow start talking about skills, but I do think the notion that the only meaning of education is to attain this object that then immediately translates into the marketplace. I don't want to give up contesting that, but I take your point and I see it as very significant.
We're good. So I just want to start off by saying that I actually enjoyed the structure of the paper, and I thought it worked really, really well. I wouldn't change the structure of it. So I have a few quick comments. The first was just a quick observation about the irony of Becker's position. You know, the irony that capitalism demands de-skilling. Right? I mean, as Marx demonstrated, I think, so persuasively, Harry Braverman, you know, in the 20th century, labor and monopoly capital. So there's an irony which he misses there, which I think, you know, might be worth, you know, adding that maybe observation somewhere in the paper. The second point is just, you know, a question: how new really is Becker's theory? Now I know, you know, he's quite explicit, and you know the development of microeconomic theory that you talk about in the application to the university, but really wasn't that understanding of education and of schools in particular the dominant understanding in, you know, of schooling in 19th century Britain? You know, that I think satirized so effectively by Dickens, you know, and the figure of the M'Chokum child, right? And you know, and challenged by Marx and challenged by the utopian socialists, etc. And then the last, I guess, comment is a little bit of skepticism, just a little bit at the end of the paper, when, you know, in holding up, and maybe you weren't doing this, so correct me if I'm wrong, but in holding up Marx as an exemplar of the pedagogy of mystery. Because to me, you know, when I read Marx, I understand, you know, the points that you're making, but stepping back and looking at Marx's work as a whole, you know, I'm a little bit concerned about the system building aspect of Marx's Marx's work, and in particular, you know, that the concern, so concerned was he to build a system that he demolished, or attempted to demolish, the argument of those who challenged that system-building process, from you know, from Fourier to Proudhon to Stirner, etc. So I'd be a little bit wary of holding Marx up as the exemplar of a pedagogy of mystery. I would look to somebody, you know, personally, I would look more to somebody like a figure like William Morris in the 19th century, who precisely was not concerned with system building, was constantly open to new ideas and to what you're describing as a pedagogy of mystery.
Great, that's a lot. The last question is runs quite deep, so I'm only going to give you the really crude shorthand, which is that I'm committed to a reading of Marx as a non-system builder. And I realize that's a weird, unorthodox reading of Marx, but I'm more and more convinced that the system building is a lot a part of Marx's reception. It's a lot a part of Engels. It's a lot a part of 20th century Marxist thought, and that in Marx's texts, by which I mean the ones that he actually wrote and published, as opposed to, say, made-up texts like the German ideology, that we now have this lot of rich historical work that Terrell Carver's been doing on the German ideology as this crazy construction of the 20th century. There are these notes that Engels drafted and Marx made notes on and got left on the floor, and they went up and picked the ones they wanted and published that and left the rest, and then in the 1920s it became a text. There's a lot of that in Marx's text that I think contributes to Marx's system builder. But I completely take your point and totally realize that pulling him out like that, and part of it I was trying to be provocative and polemical in a certain way by turning to him at the end, because you're right, there's lots of other choices. And that would be connected to a sort of separate project that would try to engage in Marx, with Marx in that way. The question about how new Becker's theory is a really important question, and important for me in terms of thinking about how I would want to contextualize work I would do on Becker. I think there is something important, not necessarily unique, but important about the location of Becker articulating an understanding of schools and the university in post-World War II America, where the university is broadening in dramatic ways. How that might look compared to 19th century Britain. I mean, if we're talking about universities, we're talking about a very small percentage of the population still going to universities. So there's something significant for me about the generalizing expansion of a logic of individual return on investment at a time when there is an expansion of university possibilities of who goes to university in the States. But contextualizing that would be really important. And your point about de-skilling is absolutely right and consistently missed by all sorts of commentators, and it points out another complete tension in the entire project of human capital theory, that is a tension in neoliberal ideology today, or just political ideology today, because of the constant discussion of building skills, when the advanced development of capitalism is absolutely all the logic points to de-skilling. There was a quote I took out of the paper that was great. Just about a month ago, U.S. Congress actually passed a piece of legislation, which never happens. It's crazy. But it was the renewal of a Jobs Act, which was a jobs training program, and Obama made a speech about it in the Rose Garden. And the language he used to say why it was important is that this act, which is basically government funding for job training, it would allow workers to earn the skills they need. So we've doubled back over and reincorporated the logic of the market into the process by which we will get the skills to enter the market. We're now not going to learn skills or be given them, we're going to earn them in a context where what earning means is erasing the fact that this was a government program, because the government can't pay for anything. So that context is absolutely crucial, and I agree entirely.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm just going to follow up on a few points, and I'm going to ask you a really unfair thing, which is to place yourself in the mind of Becker, because I had a number of questions relating to that. I work in primary elementary education, and I was trying to think about how would Becker conceptualize a 4-year-old as a trainee worker, deferring present pleasures, for instance, for future return on investment. So how do children work in terms of that kind of economic model? So that's the first question. And they're all interrelated because they're all asking you to tell me what Becker might say. And the second one was when I talked to my primary school student teachers, and I asked them why educate children, and they say, well, for the workplace. And you go, well, I mean, you know, we're not being very efficient here. Like, why are they learning about pyramids and Egypt and the jungle? I mean, this is all irrelevant material. So why haven't there been more calls to, in a sense, absolutely strip mine the curriculum and begin to streamline children in very narrow ways based perhaps on their mathematical competences? 5-year-olds maybe? So that's the first part of it, is in terms of how would somebody like Becker respond to children as trainee workers and to the curriculum. But the second element is more empirical in terms of the standards movement in the US, for instance. We don't have it so much here, it's in Britain, but you know, how does the standards movement and the Common Core relate to the skills movement? Because in a sense it is back to this question of de-skilling. It doesn't seem like skills are foregrounded within that standards movement. So that's the first element. And the second is, again, trying to think through this model of neoliberalism. Schools are now sites for essentially expropriation of public funds or individual funds by fund managers. I mean, so they are, with the privatization of schooling, the growth of charter schools, the way that fund managers can place in, say, somebody like Obama, these are sites of expropriation, of direct expropriation of monies, either state monies or individual money, say, at university level. So it's not, I mean, it's a peculiar kind of model in that sense, because sometimes it is public monies. And I'm just wondering how that fits in with the model that you've been presenting.
Okay, I think I'll take the last one first, because I think there's a short answer to that one, which is I think that this expropriation of funds, particularly public funds, those transformations, I think that is a part of neoliberal transformations to contemporary capitalism, but I think it's probably better explained by one of those strands that I set aside by looking at human capital theory. I think that the movement from an embedded capitalism to a disembedded capitalism, financialization, this expansion of the logic where we must locate new markets, I think that explains many of these phenomena fairly well. So which is not to say that the two are unrelated, but weaving the threads together is a complex task, and I think the primary explanation for what you're talking about lies there. I don't know, I know the controversy over the Common Core. I know a bit about it from the outside, but I haven't read closely and carefully. I think my intuition is that there are a series of tensions between the language of skills that is so dominant and the actual implementation of curricular reform that doesn't always directly implement that. I think in the American context, that has something to do with ideals of meritocracy and the American ability to pretend that there isn't class. I think, which is also connected to your second question about why not more calls to absolutely, I think, strip mine, I like that word, the curriculum. I think there are forces out there that would very much like to do that, but I think there's a wariness to say, okay, these 6-year-olds, we need to start training them as janitors, because American inequality is made possible by the myth of meritocracy, right? We have really good data now about not only is social and economic inequality dramatically higher in the States, but social mobility is dramatically lower. There's much more social mobility in, say, France. But if you poll Americans on whether there's more social mobility in France or America, you're probably going to get, I don't know, 70, 80% are going to say in the States. So it's part of that myth. And I think that would undermine the myth dramatically if we started. So I think that's connected to class. That this idea that people are suited to need certain specific sets of skills early on would really trouble things. And actually, instead, a lot of curricular changes may be explicable in the broader context of this is where we hold on to the myth of the American dream of pure social mobility. So there has to be some sort of appearance of a kind of flat horizontal equality, even in the face of what we know is radically unequal schooling, which has also been transformed, here's another dimension of neoliberalism, by the fact that even in publicly funded open schools that aren't charter schools and aren't magnet schools. We now have this system whereby the public schools in the nicer neighborhoods are being run by hundreds and thousands of dollars of money given by parents and hundreds of thousands of hours of free labor in those communities. So again, I see that as here is a kind of superficial myth of meritocracy with all sorts of structures that are turning that horizontal flatness into quite a hierarchy. How would Becker think about the 4-year-old? I haven't read completely in a lot of Becker's later, more advanced applications of, here, let's think about human capital theory in this context, in this context, in this context. So it may be that there's Becker or someone working directly in Becker's vein who thinks about younger age primary schooling in terms of where you start applying the equation of the student being like a worker. And so I'm not sure about that. But my sense is that there would be a hinge point there somewhere. I imagine the answer is that for the 4-year-old, the parents need to be thinking about maximizing the return on investment of the 4-year-old. I mean, and this sounds, but I mean this sincerely, like this I think would be the Becker answer. I'm not just trying to caricature his position, but that, I mean, this is the logic. So I think that the parents would basically, they would run the return on investment calculations and say, well, we want our child in this school or this school, focusing on these things or these things. And then at a certain point, the equations are the same. At a certain point, you just decide that the child is now, has reason and can run the calculations themselves. But I think that algebra would be the same throughout. I just think the parents would have to be running it. And the parents might therefore also conclude that, oh, well, one of the things we need for the longer-term return on investment of our 4-year-old is the ability to play with blocks. So for now, that's okay. But at a certain point, you start going in that direction.
Can I just say, thinking about that, there's an economist, a Nobel economist at the University of Chicago called James Hickman, who is an education theorist and who has been working with the public schools to, sorry, I thought I was loud enough. I just thought, because this person might want to know that, so James Hickman has the idea that, and this has to do with the deferred wages thing, that that if every child in America was given $100,000 at the beginning of their life, there would be no inequality. Isn't that mind-blowing? And that's liberal educational theory from the perspective of neoliberal.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap us up now, but I just want to thank everyone for contributing.